Is the Vatican hiding something that could shake the foundations of our faith? What if I told you that ancient African scrolls attributed to the biblical patriarch contain prophecies about 2025 that the Church doesn't want you to know? Sounds outrageous, maybe, but sometimes truth is stranger than fiction. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most controversial religious mysteries of our time. Enoch's Black Scrolls and their forbidden 2025 prophecy that has allegedly shocked the Vatican to its core. They don't want you asking these questions. They don't want you connecting these dots. But together, we're going to explore what might be the most significant biblical revelation of our lifetime. Are you ready for this journey? Because once you hear this, there's no going back. The name Enoch appears briefly in Genesis. Yet, this man who walked with God and was not for God took him may hold the key to understanding what's coming in 2025. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved texts that Western Christianity rejected. Why? What are they hiding from us? Let's find out. Who exactly was Enoch, and why should his writings matter to us today? Genesis 5:204 tells us something extraordinary. Enoch walked with God. Then he was no more because God took him away. Think about that. He didn't die like other patriarchs. God simply took him. This man had such an intimate relationship with the Creator that he bypassed death entirely. And yet, most Western churches barely mention him. Enoch was the seventh patriarch from Adam, the great-grandfather of Noah, and one of only two people in Scripture who never experienced death. The other was Elijah. But while Elijah's story is widely taught, Enoch's deeper legacy remains shrouded in mystery, particularly his writings that have been preserved primarily through African Christian traditions. What most believers don't realize is that Enoch's writings were considered scripture by many early Christians. The book of Enoch is directly quoted in the New Testament in Jude chapter 1, 14-15. Yet somehow these texts disappeared from Western Christianity while remaining canonical in Ethiopia. The question is why the Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved the Book of En in its entirety in the ancient Gi language. This African nation mentioned throughout Scripture's coup maintained these sacred texts when others discarded them. But what's truly fascinating is the persistent rumor of additional Enochian writings, what some scholars and mystics have called the Black Scrolls, containing prophecies so specific and so shocking that they've been deliberately suppressed. These aren't just any prophecies. According to those who claim knowledge of these texts, they contain explicit predictions about events unfolding right now and culminating in 2025. If true, we're living the very times that Enoch foresaw thousands of years ago, and the implications are staggering. The term Black Scrolls carries multiple meanings. Some suggest it refers to the dark parchment they were written on. Others believe it indicates their African origin, and still others propose it signifies their blacklisted status knowledge deemed too dangerous for public consumption. Whatever the case, these texts supposedly contain wisdom that predates Moses. Wisdom preserved through African oral and written traditions that the Western Church has either ignored or actively suppressed. Bereshit Barlohim at Hasheme Viter Heretzes. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. These ancient Hebrew words open our Bible, but the ancient wisdom didn't start or end there. The Ethiopian Christians preserved texts that others discarded. Why? What made these African believers so certain these writings were worth safeguarding when the Council of Nicaea decided otherwise? The Book of Enoch describes fallen angels' cosmic battles and end-time scenarios with vivid detail. But the rumored Black Scrolls go further, allegedly containing prophecies specific to our time, including a major spiritual awakening beginning in Africa and spreading globally, culminating in 2025. According to those who claim familiarity with these texts, they describe a time when the foundations of man's knowledge will be shaken, and the hidden will become revealed. They speak of a period when those who were last shall be recognized as first in the kingdom, potentially referring to the elevation of marginalized voices in spiritual leadership. If these claims are true, we're not just talking about another doomsday prediction. We're talking about a fundamental shift in spiritual understanding that challenges centuries of established theological hierarchy. No wonder certain powers might want such texts suppressed. The prophecies allegedly speak of the sons of Cush rising to reclaim the wisdom of their fathers, and the daughters of Zion recognizing their sisters in strange lands. These cryptic phrases suggest a reconciliation and recognition across cultural and racial lines that would transform our understanding of faith itself. 1 in 39 warns, "Behold, he comes with 10,000 of his holy ones to execute judgment upon all, and to destroy all the ungodly, and to convict all flesh of all the works of their ungodliness." Jude quotes this passage directly. But what if the Black Scrolls contain even more specific details about this judgment, details pointing to our present moment? The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained for centuries that their canon, which includes Enoch, represents a more complete biblical tradition. They trace their Christian heritage directly, Acts 8, where Philip baptized the Ethiopian eunuch. This means their tradition credits many Western church practices. Could they have preserved what others lost or deliberately discarded? Scholars have long puzzled over why certain texts were excluded from the Western canon. Politics played a role, certainly. But what if some writings were deemed too dangerous, not because they were false, but because they were true in ways that threatened established power? The Vatican's library is one of the most extensive and secretive in the world, with over 75,000 codices and 1 million printed books, including countless ancient manuscripts. What might be hidden in its restricted archives? Former Vatican insiders have hinted at kiakins of texts deemed too sensitive for public access, texts that could destabilize faith, if widely circulated. In 2016, rumors circulated that fragments of previously unknown Enochian texts had been discovered in Ethiopia containing prophecies about our current era. Vatican officials allegedly moved quickly to examine these findings, after which they disappeared from public discussion. Coincidence or containment? The Ethiopian manuscripts reportedly contained references to the time when men build towers that reach the clouds and when voices travel across the world in an instant. Apparent references to modern skyscrapers and telecommunications. But most disturbing to authorities, according to these claims, were predictions about a great revealing scheduled for 2025. What exactly is supposed to happen in 2025? According to those claiming knowledge of these prophecies, it involves a massive spiritual awakening, the exposure of long-hidden truths, and a fundamental reordering of religious understanding that center voices long pushed to the margins. If you're skeptical, that's understandable. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. But consider this. Throughout history, powerful institutions have suppressed information that threatened their authority. From Galileo's astronomical discoveries to Martin Luther's theological challenges, truth has often been deemed dangerous by those in power. The Book of Enoch itself was widely read by early Christians, but gradually pushed aside as church hierarchies solidified. Why? Perhaps because it contains passages like this from 1 Enoch 46-5. "And he shall put down the kings from their thrones and kingdoms, because they do not extol and praise him, nor humbly acknowledge whence the kingdom was bestowed upon them." Messages challenging authority structures don't tend to be popular with authorities. Is it so hard to believe that prophecies predicting a spiritual revolution might be suppressed by those fit from the status quo, Annie Munishelma? I believe with perfect faith. This Hebrew declaration of faith reminds us that true belief requires courage. the courage to question, to seek to look beyond comfortable narratives. And perhaps that's what these prophecies are calling us to do. The alleged 2025 prophecy speaks of the children of Ham reclaiming their spiritual birthright, and the wisdom of the East and South rising as the wisdom of the North and West falters. These phrases suggest a rebalancing of spiritual authority that centers African, Middle Eastern, and indigenous traditions that have been marginalized by European Christianity. For too long, Western theological perspectives have dominated global Christianity, often dismissing or demonizing African spiritual insights. But what if some of the most profound biblical truths were preserved precisely where Western missionaries least expected to find them, in the ancient traditions of Ethiopian Christianity? The Book of Enoch describes how certain angels descended to earth and taught humans forbidden knowledge. And as Aziel taught men to make swords and knives and shields and breastplates, and made known to them the metals of the earth and the art of working them. Sanjis taught enchantments, Barku Kujul taught astrology. Kayu Kabel the constellations 1 and 8 B13. This ancient text presents a view of human technological development as potentially corrupting, a perspective that seems increasingly prophetic in our age of AI genetic engineering and weapons of mass destruction. But the Black Scrolls allegedly go further, describing a time when man's creations will begin to overtake their creators, and the image will seem to live but carry death within it. Sound familiar? We're living in an era where artificial intelligence is advancing at a breathtaking pace, where deep fakes can make images seem to live, and where technology brings both wonder and puerile. If these ancient texts predicted such developments, what else might they have foreseen about our immediate future? The Ethiopian connection to these prophecies cannot be overstated. Ethiopia is mentioned more than 40 times in the Bible. Often called Cush, this ancient African kingdom maintained independence when much of the continent fell to colonial powers, preserving unique Christian traditions dating back to the 1st century. When European missionaries reached Ethiopia in the 17th century, they were shocked to find a sophisticated Christian tradition that predated their arrival by over 1,500 years, one that included texts like Enoch that had been lost to Western Christianity. Rather than recognizing the value of these preserved traditions, many dismissed them as primitive or heretical. This pattern of dismissing African spiritual wisdom continues today. When scholars point to the Ethiopian preservation of Enoch as evidence of its importance, they're often met with skepticism from Western theological institutions. But what if Ethiopia preserved not just the known Book of Enoch, but additional writings that contain even more challenging revelations? The Dead Sea Scrolls discovered between 1947 and 96 contained multiple fragments of Enochian literature confirming that these texts were widely read by Jewish communities around the time of Jesus. This archaeological evidence forced scholars to reconsider the importance of Enoch in early Jewish and Christian thought. Among the Qumran findings were portions of the Book of Giants, an expansion of the Enotive that was previously known only through references. This discovery raises a compelling question. What other Enochian texts might have existed that we haven't yet rediscovered? Archaeological findings in Ethiopia's ancient monasteries continue this day, with manuscripts being cataloged and translated that have remained untouched for centuries. Could the rumored Black Scrolls be among them? Some researchers believe they've already been found, but are being studied in secret due to their explosive content. Yeshua said difficiles. The truth will set you free. But sometimes truth is suppressed because it threatens established power. Throughout history, from the burning of the Library of Alexandria to colonial powers destroying indigenous knowledge, information control has been a tool of domination. The Vatican's stance on literature has been complicated. While never officially condemning the Book of Enoch, the Catholic Church excluded it from the biblical canon established at the Council of Trent. Yet, references to Enoch appear in the Church Fathers' writings indicating they considered it valuable if not canonical. In recent years, some Vatican scholars have shown renewed interest in non-canonical texts, including Enoch. But this academic interest comes with careful theological boundaries. Any text suggesting radical revisions to established doctrine, particularly regarding authority structures, would naturally face institutional resistance. The alleged 2025 prophecy is said to predict the Mother Church recognizing her forgotten children, and the shepherds being called to account by their flocks. Such language, if authentic, would certainly alarm church hierarchies built on top-down authority models. But here's where we need to be careful. While questioning institutional narratives is important, we must avoid falling into baseless conspiracy theories. Not everything hidden is hidden maliciously. Sometimes, ancient texts are studied carefully before public release to ensure accurate translation and proper historical context. That said, the pattern of Western dismissal of African spiritual traditions is well documented and troubling. From the colonial era onward, European powers systematically devalued indigenous knowledge while imposing their own religious interpretations, often as a tool of subjugation rather than liberation. Jesus himself warned about religious leaders who shut the door of the kingdom of heaven in people's faces and who load people down with burdens they can hardly carry. Matthew 2, the 3:13 and 4. These warnings remind us that spiritual gatekeeping has always been a danger within religious institutions. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has maintained a distinct Christian tradition that includes texts like Enoch, Jubilees, and others not found in Western Bibles. Their canon wasn't established by Roman emperors or European councils, but through their own apostolic tradition, dating back to the Ethiopian eunuch's conversion in Acts 8. This African expression of Christianity preserved elements that Western churches discarded. The question is, was this preservation accidental, or did Ethiopian Christians recognize value in these texts that others missed or deliberately suppressed? The Book of Enoch contains passages that could be interpreted as challenging to institutional power. It describes angelic beings who abused their authority and were punished by God. It portrays a divine judgment that evaluates rulers harshly for their treatment of the vulnerable. These themes might make uncomfortable reading for those benefiting from unjust systems. But the rumored Black Scrolls allegedly go further, describing a time when those who claim to speak for God will be revealed as speaking for themselves, and when the true servants will be found among those the false shepherds rejected. Such prophecies would naturally alarm religious authorities whose legitimacy depends on claims of divine sanction. Let's address the skeptics directly. Many will dismiss this entire topic as fabrication, noting the lack of publicly available evidence for these alleged Black Scrolls. That's a fair criticism. Without examining the primary sources, we cannot definitively confirm their existence or content. However, absence of evidence isn't necessarily evidence of absence, especially when dealing with potentially restricted ancient texts. The Dead Sea Scrolls remained unknown for nearly 2 millennia until their discovery in 1947. The Nag Hammadi Library of Gnostic Texts was similarly hidden until 1945. What other ancient rites might still await discovery or disclosure? Some scholars suggest that rather than physical Black Scrolls, what exists is an oral tradition, preserved in Ethiopian monasteries, prophecies attributed to Enoch passed down through generations of monks sworn to secrecy until the appointed time of revelation. Others propose that fragments exist in multiple locations, some in Ethiopia, others possibly in Vatican archives, others perhaps in private collections with no single repository holding the complete text. This dispersal would make suppression easier, as no one source could reveal the full prophecies. Whatever the case, the Ethiopian connection remains central to this mystery. Ethiopia's Tewahedo Orthodox Church maintained independence when much of global Christianity fell under European influence. Their preservation of texts like Enoch demonstrates their commitment to maintaining traditions others abandoned. The Ethiopian Bible contains 81 books compared to the 66 in most Protestant Bibles or 73 in Catholic ones. This expanded canon includes texts considered apocryphal or pseudepi by Western churches. Ethiopian Christians view these not as additions but as the original, more complete scriptural tradition. Among these texts, Enoch holds special significance. Ethiopian tradition holds that the Ark of the Covenant itself resides in Axum, guarded by monks who maintain ancient practices dating back to Solomon and Menelik. If any church had access to additional Enochian writings, the Ethiopian Orthodox would be the most likely candidates. The alleged 2025 prophecy is said to predict the Ark revealing its purpose again and the covenant being renewed among all peoples. These phrases suggest a spiritual reunification that transcends denominational and racial divisions, a theme consistent with biblical promises, but potentially threatening to institutions built on exclusivity. Baruch Hashem. Blessed be the name. In Hebrew tradition, God's true name was spoken only by the high priest once a year in the Holy of Holies. Some knowledge was considered too sacred for casual disclosure. Could a similar principle apply to these prophecies, not suppression, but protection until the appropriate time? The book of Daniel was instructed to seal up the vision, for it concerns the distant future. Daniel 8:2-26. Similarly, Revelation mentions a scroll sealed with 7 seals that only the Lamb could open. Biblical precedent exists for prophetic knowledge being preserved but sealed until its appointed time. If the Black Scrolls exist and contain authentic prophecies about 2025, we're approaching the moment of their relevance. According to those claiming knowledge of these texts, they describe our current era with uncanny accuracy, mentioning plagues that circle the earth, a COVID-19 fires consuming forests, climate disasters, and nations rising against nations while denying they are at war, a modern hybrid warfare. Most significantly, they allegedly predict a spiritual awakening beginning in Africa and spreading globally. A revival that centers voices long marginalized and reveals truths long suppressed. This awakening supposedly culminates in 2025 with events that shake the foundations of faith, but strengthen true believers. Is any of this true without examining the primary sources? We cannot say definitively, but the patterns of Western dismissal of African spiritual traditions combined with institutional creates history of suppressing challenging voices make the scenario plausible. What we know with certainty is that Enoch was considered important enough to be quoted in the New Testament. We know that Ethiopian Christians preserved his writings when Western churches discarded them. And we know that archaeological discoveries like the Dead Sea Scrolls have repeatedly validated the antiquity of texts once dismissed as later fabrications. The Ethiopian manuscript tradition remains one of the richest and least explored in biblical studies. Monasteries like Debre Damo and Debre Libanos contain thousands of manuscripts, many still untranslated and uncatalogued. What secrets might they contain that could transform our understanding of biblical history? In 2018, researchers using imaging technology discovered previously unknown texts in Ethiopian manuscripts. Palimpsests where older writings had been scraped away and written over but remain detectable with modern technology. These discoveries confirm that there's still much to learn from these ancient African collections. The colonial dismissal of African Christianity has robbed us all of spiritual insights. European missionaries often approached African believers not as equals with valuable traditions but lank lace needing Western theology. This arrogance led to the marginalization of African perspectives that might have enriched global Christianity. Jesus himself had African connections. He spent his childhood as a refugee in Egypt, and some of Cyrene and in modern Libya carried his cross. The early church included leaders like Augustine of Hippo, born in North Africa. Christianity has never been exclusively European, despite colonial attempts to make it so. The Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8, one of the first Gentile converts, was reading Isaiah when Philip encountered him. This African official was already engaged with Jewish scriptures before meeting Christian evangelists. His conversion represents not the bringing of God's word to Africa, but Africa's embrace and message that filled what they already valued. If the Black Scrolls exist and contain authentic prophecies about our time, what might they tell us about 2025? According to those claiming familiarity with these texts, they describe not an apocalyptic destruction, but a revelatory unveiling. Apocalypsis in Greek literally means unveiling or revelation. This unveiling supposedly involves the exposure of long hidden truths, the elevation of marginalized voices, and a spiritual awakening that begins in Africa and transforms global Christianity. Rather than the end of the world, it would represent a new beginning, one that challenges established hierarchies but fulfills ancient promises. Ezekiel 37:17 describes two sticks becoming one, representing the reunification of divided peoples. The alleged 2025 prophecy similarly speaks of the scattered becoming gathered and divided by man's traditions being united by God's truth. These themes of reconciliation resonate with biblical promises while challenging denominational divisions. Some skeptics suggest that any discussion of African biblical traditions is divisive. But that perspective itself reveals the problem. The assumption that Western Christianity is the default normal while African expressions are other. True unity doesn't require uniformity or the erasure of distinct traditions. Psalm 68:31 declares, "Cusha, Ethiopia, will quickly stretch out her hands to God." This prophecy suggests African spiritual leadership that many Western commentators have overlooked or reinterpreted. What if we've been missing a biblical promise of African spiritual revival that's now approaching fulfillment? The early church was remarkably diverse, including Africans, Middle Easterners, Europeans, and Asians. Acts 131 mentions Simeon called Niger, and Niger meaning black, and Lucius of Cyrene, North Africa, among the leaders of the Antioch church. This multi-ethnic leadership was normative, not exceptional. Colonial Christianity often presented a European Jesus and European disciples, erasing the Middle Eastern and African connections of early Christianity. This whitewashing served imperial purposes, but distorted biblical truth. The alleged Black Scrolls prophecy supposedly predicts a correction of this distortion. The stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. As Psalm 118, 2022, Jesus applied this verse to himself, but it may have broader applications. Could the spiritual traditions preserved in Africa, rejected by Western theological builders, contain insights crucial for our time? The Ethiopian Orthodox Church traces its founding to the apostolic era, specifically to the Ethiopian eunuch conversion in Acts 8. This makes it one of the oldest continuous Christian traditions in the world, predating the formation of the Roman Catholic Church as we know it today. Despite this ancient lineage, Ethiopian Christianity is often treated as peripheral in Western theological education. Few seminaries require study of Ethiopian church history or the texts they preserved. This marginalization reflects colonial attitudes that prioritized European expressions of faith. The alleged 2025 prophecy speaks of the first becoming last and the last becoming first, echoing Jesus' words in Matthew 20:16. This suggests a reordering of spiritual authority that elevates previously marginalized traditions while challenging those who have claimed exclusive interpretive rights. Such a reordering wouldn't negate Western Christianity, but would place it in proper context as one expression among many, rather than the definitive standard. This perspective shift threatens power, but actually fulfills biblical principles of equality among believers. What makes these alleged prophecies particularly intriguing is their specificity. According to those claiming knowledge of them, they describe technologies unimaginable. In ancient times, chariots that move without horses, words and images traveling instantly across vast distances, and weapons that can destroy cities in moments. If authentic, such descriptions would be remarkable evidence of prophetic foreknowledge. Similar passages in the known book of Enoch describe astronomical phenomena that ancient humans shouldn't have been able to calculate, including knowledge of solar and lunar calendars that show sophisticated understanding. The Black Scrolls allegedly go further, describing our specific moment in history with references to plagues followed by wars, the wealthy fleeing to the heavens, a space travel, and false images that appear real. It deep fakes. Such specificity would be difficult to dismiss as vague prophecy that could fit any era. Most significantly, they supposedly predict spiritual developments in our time, including a great awakening that begins where the sun rises on the continent of the original peoples and spreads globally, challenging religious institutions and reuniting believers across manufactured divisions. If you're skeptical about all this, that's understandable and even healthy. Critical thinking is essential when evaluating extraordinary claims, but also consider why African spiritual traits have been systematically devalued in Western discourse and how that devaluation might have caused us to miss valuable insights. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved texts like Enoch that were excluded from Western canons. They maintained distinctive practices that connect directly to ancient Judaism and early Christianity. Their tradition deserves serious engagement, not dismissal or exoticization. Whether or not the specific Black Scrolls exist as describe the pattern of Western dismissal of African spiritual wisdom is well documented and troubling. From colonial missionaries condemning Inditist practices to modern scholars marginalizing African theological perspectives. This dismissal has impoverished global Christianity. Jesus warned about religious leaders who travel over land and sea to win a single convert. And when you have succeeded, you make them twice as much a child of hell as you are. In Matthew chapter 23, this caution against spiritual colonization remains relevant when considering how European Christianity was often imposed through colonial violence. The true scandal may not be what's hidden in Vatican archives, but what's been hiding in plain sight. The rich spiritual traditions of African Christianity that Western institutions have systematically marginalized. The Ethiopian preservation of texts like Enoch represents not an aberration, but a continuation of ancient practice. What if the real prophecy for 2025 is simply the long overdue recognition of African Christian traditions as equal partners in theological discourse? What if the great revealing is the unveiling of truths preserved in Ethiopia that Western Christianity discarded to its detriment? Revelation 7:39 describes a great multitude that no one could count from every nation, tribe, people, and language standing before the throne. This vision of diverse unity, not uniformity, represents the biblical ideal. True Christian unity doesn't erase cultural distinctiveness, but celebrates it within shared devotion. The alleged 2025 prophecy supposedly describes the lion lying down with the lamb, not just spiritually, but in terms of reconciliation between peoples long divided by human prejudice. This healing of racial divisions would fulfill biblical promises while challenging systems built on separation and hierarchy. Micah 4:34 promises a time when everyone will sit under their own vine and under their own fig tree, and no one will make them afraid. This vision of security, dignity, and self-determination for all peoples resonates with the alleged prophecies about 2025 as a time of spiritual liberation and reconciliation. If these prophecies exist and prove accurate, they would represent not the end of faith, but its renewal, a correction of distortions introduced through centuries of politicized theology and colonial imposition. Such renewal would challenge institutions, but strengthen authentic spirituality. Adonai, the Lord, is one. This Hebrew declaration from Deuteronomy 6:24 reminds us that despite our human divisions, we worship one God. If the Black Scrolls exist and contain authentic prophecies, their ultimate mess would be unity, not division, the recognition that artificial barriers between believers contradict divine intention. The Ethiopian Church has preserved not just texts, but practices that connect directly to ancient Judaism, including dietary laws, Sabbath observance, and reverence for the Ark of the Covenant. These continuities suggest not a divergence from biblical faith, but a preservation of elements that Western Christianity abandoned. When King Solomon met the Queen of Sheba, a believed to be Ethiopian in many traditions, their encounter represented a recognition of mutual wisdom and spiritual insight. This biblical precedent for respectful exchange between Middle Eastern and African traditions offers a model for contemporary engagement. The alleged 2025 prophecy speaks of the Queen's wisdom being recognized again, and the King's son honoring his mother's people. These phrases suggest a renewal of respect for Ethiopian spiritual traditions and recognition of their value for global Christianity. What's particularly significant about Ethiopian Christianity is its independence. Unlike many African churches, it wasn't established by European missionaries, but maintains a direct lineage to apostolic times. This independence allowed it to preserve traditions that might otherwise have been suppressed by colonial influence. The Kibroghist, Ethiopia's national epic, describes how Menelli, son of Solomon and Sheba, brought the Ark of the Covenant to Ethiopia. While Western scholars often dismiss this as legend, Ethiopian Christians maintain that the Ark remains an axum, guarded by a succession of monks who alone may view it. If this tradition contains truth, it suggests that Ethiopia may indeed preserve sacred knowledge unsuspected by Western institutions. The alleged Black Scrolls would represent just one element of this preserved wisdom: prophecies kept until their appointed time of revelation. The 2025 prophecy supposedly describes the Ark revealing its purpose again, and the covenant being renewed among all peoples. These phrases suggest not just Ethiopian validation, but a spiritual renewal that transcends cultural boundaries while honoring previously marginalized traditions. What should we make of all this? Without examining the primary sources, if they exist, we cannot definitively confirm or deny these claims. But we can recognize the pattern of Western dismissal of African spiritual traditions, and how that dismissal has impoverished global Christianity. We can acknowledge that Ethiopian Christians preserved texts like Enoch that were excluded from Western canons but quoted in the New Testament itself. We can recognize that archaeological discoveries have repeatedly validated the antiquity of texts once dismissed as later fabrications. And we can approach with humility the possibility that spiritual wisdom may come from sources long marginalized by Western institutions. Jesus himself warned that the first will be last, and the last will be first. Matthew 2:06, a principle that may apply to theological traditions as well as individuals. If you're intrigued by these possibilities, I encourage you to explore the Book of Enoch for yourself. Though not in most Western Bibles, English translations are readily available. Its vivid descriptions of cosmic warfare, fallen angels, and divine judgment provide context for many New Testament concepts. Beyond and consider exploring the broader Ethiopian Christian tradition, an expression of faith that maintained independence when much of global Christianity fell under European influence. Their preservation of texts and practices connects directly to ancient Judaism and early Christianity in ways that challenge Western assumptions. Most importantly, approach with openness the possibility that God's truth isn't confined to familiar institutional channels. Throughout biblical history, prophetic voices often came from the margins, challenging religious establishments rather than emerging from them. Jeremiah 29:13 promises, "You will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart." This seeking requires openness to finding truth in unexpected places, perhaps even in ancient African texts preserved when Western institutions discarded them. As we approach 2025, remain watchful but discerning. Not every claim of hidden knowledge has merit, but dismissing possibilities solely because they challenge established narratives reflects precisely the institutional arrogance that Jesus consistently confronted. The greatest revelation may not be dramatic, cosmic events, but a spiritual awakening that challenges artificial divisions and recognizes the unity of all believers across cultural, denominational, and racial lines. Such awakening would fulfill biblical promises while threatening institutions built on exclusivity and hierarchy. Whether or not specific prophecies about 2025 exist in hidden Ethiopian texts, the broader pattern of Western dismissal of African spiritual wisdom represents a failure that needs correction. True Christian unity requires recognizing the value of diverse traditions, not imposing uniformity through institutional power. The Ethiopian preservation of texts like Enoch represents not an aberration, but a continuation of ancient practice. Their tradition deserves serious engagement, not dismissal or exoticization. What wisdom might global Christianity recover by approaching these preserved traditions with respect rather than suspicion? Revelation describes a time when the mystery of God will be accomplished. A Revelation 1:7. Perhaps part of that mystery includes the recognition of spiritual truths preserved in traditions long marginalized by Western institutions, a completion of the global Christian mosaic that includes pieces previously pushed aside. As we conclude this exploration, I invite you to approach these possibilities with both critical thinking and spiritual openness. Question institutional narratives that have marginalized African Christian traditions. Explore texts like Enoch that connect to New Testament teachings while expanding our understanding of cosmic history. Most importantly, recognize that God's truth transcends human divisions. Whether or not specific black scrolls exist with prophecies about 2025, the principle remains. There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. Galatians 3:28. This oneness doesn't erase distinctive traditions but embraces them within a larger unity. Ethiopian Christianity preserved elements that Western churches discarded not as competitors, but as custodians of aspects of a shared heritage. Their voice deserves hearing in the global Christian conversation. If 2025 brings a spiritual awakening that challenges institutional hierarchies while uniting believers across manufactured divisions, such development would fulfill biblical promises regardless whether specific ancient prophecies predicted it. The ultimate prophecy remains Jesus' prayer that they may be one as we are one at John 17:22-22. Tell us what you think. Have you explored the Book of Enoch or other texts preserved in the Ethiopian tradition? What insights have you gained from engaging with Christian expressions beyond familiar Western denominations? Share this video with others interested in exploring the full richness of our spiritual heritage. The mystery of Enoch's legacy continues to unfold. The Ethiopian preservation of his writings invites us to consider what other wisdom might be rediscovered as we approach global Christianity with humility rather than institutional arrogance. Whatever 2025 brings, may it find us seeking truth with open hearts and minds. Shalom Aleichem. Peace be upon you. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep your heart open to truth wherever it may be found, even in ancient African texts preserved when others discarded them.